Why is mental suffering so often dismissed as a lack of faith within our communities? In this deep dive analysis, we confront the reality of mental health challenges in the Muslim community, dismantle the dangerous stigma surrounding therapy, and explore why seeking psychological help is a vital part of prophetic wellness. Welcome to a critical explainer that is absolutely going to challenge everything you might think you know about mental health. I am so glad you're joining me for this because what we are unpacking today isn't just academic theory. It's about real lives, real history, and real healing.
Look, we hear it all the time, right? Just pray more, or a true believer doesn't get depressed. It's this heavy, deeply ingrained assumption that has literally isolated countless people who are silently hurting. But as we're going to see today, the science and the history actually point us in a completely different, incredibly compassionate direction.
And that is exactly our mission for today's explainer. We're going to confront these modern challenges head on. We are actively dismantling the stigma that equates psychological struggle with spiritual weakness. And most importantly, we're going to explore how seeking professional help isn't abandoning your faith at all. It is actually a deeply rooted part of prophetic wellness. Okay, let's dive right in. Starting with Section 1, the lack of faith myth. We're dismantling the stigma of praying away biological trauma. There is a huge, stark contrast between the myth that mental illness is just a weakness of faith and the actual scientific reality. Mental health is multifactorial. It involves biology, your environment, genetics, and hormones. Take postpartum depression, for example. Dr. Rania Awad, a leading psychiatrist in this space, points out that postpartum depression affects 1 in 5 women. That is a massive, stark hormonal shift in the body. It's biology. To look at a mother suffering from this and tell her it's because her faith is weak, that's not just scientifically wrong, it's profoundly harmful. It isn't a spiritual failing. It's a medical reality that requires real medical treatment. And, Prophet Muhammad deeply validated human emotion. When his infant son Ibrahim passed away, he wept. He literally said, "The eyes will shed tears, the heart will feel sorrow." Think about that. He didn't mask his grief with toxic positivity. He didn't pretend everything was perfectly fine just because he was a believer. He normalized profound human grief. Acknowledging your pain, crying, feeling genuine sorrow, that is a completely normal human experience, entirely bypassing the toxic positivity that sometimes gets pushed by misinformed leaders today. Let's move to Section 2, a community under pressure. We're looking at the compounding trauma of the modern era. So the crucial point here is that trauma doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Let's look at recent history. In 2017, we saw the acute angst of the travel ban. By 2018, there was massive online Islamophobia and backlash. In 2019, fears surrounding the public charge rule deeply impacted immigrants and asylum seekers. And tragically, some felt so cornered they took their own lives. Then 2020 brought the intense isolation of the global pandemic. And right up to the present day, we are processing ongoing, devastating global grief. This validates the legitimate compounding trauma experienced by the community. It's just relentless. When you stack all of those events together, you get massive modern psychological burdens. People are dealing with a thwarted sense of belonging, intense feelings of being a burden to others, the daily grinding friction of Islamophobia and systemic bias, unprocessed global grief, like the heartbreaking loss of life in Gaza. And on top of all that, intergenerational trauma, passed down through families fleeing war and displacement. These external pressures create deeply rooted, complex psychological realities. You simply cannot brush them under the rug. They require serious, professional mental health care. Which brings us to Section 3, the toll of unspoken pain, confronting the crisis of suicide. This is really difficult data to process, but we have to talk about it. Research shows that when you look at lifetime suicide attempts, the rate within the Muslim community is shockingly nearly double that of the general population and other faith groups. Double. This recent spike is incredibly alarming, and researchers tie it directly back to those compounding traumas we were just talking about, specifically that thwarted sense of belonging and intense feelings of being a burden. This is exactly what happens when pain is left unspoken and unsupported in the dark. But we absolutely must internalize this truth. Suicide is 100% preventable with the correct support and measures. Tragedies, like the heartbreaking case of the Texas family that shook the nation a while back, they are preventable. When communities are equipped with proper psychological intervention, active crisis response, and zero stigma around seeking help, we save lives. It's really that simple, and it's that crucial. Okay, let's shift gears and look to the past. Section 4, Islam's Lost Healing Heritage, Uncovering the Golden Age of Islamic Psychology. We have to anchor this historical deep dive with another incredibly powerful prophetic command. Seek out treatments, O servants of Allah. The prophet taught that God does not send an illness without also sending a cure. And honestly, this completely dismantles the idea that taking medication or going to therapy is somehow un-Islamic. Taking care of your mind and your body is an act of faith. It's literally a fulfillment of this exact command. Early scholars understood this on such a deep level. Take Imam al-Ghazali's interconnected model of the human psyche. The soul, the ego, the heart, the mind, and the emotions. They aren't separate compartments. They constantly interact. In early Islamic psychology, treating the mind without treating the soul merely reduces surface-level symptoms. True healing requires looking at the whole person, the whole shebang from the inside out. And get this, it is absolutely mind-blowing how advanced these early scholars were. The 9th century diagnostic criteria for obsessions, written by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, are practically identical to the modern DSM-5 criteria for OCD used by psychiatrists today. Over a millennium before modern psychology claimed to discover OCD, early Muslim scholars were accurately diagnosing it and utilizing cognitive behavioral techniques like exposure therapy. History literally had to be rewritten when modern journals finally reviewed this data. And they didn't just write textbooks about it. They built incredible institutions for it. These were the Bimrastans or Maristans, historical hospitals. They were built right in the center of the city to prevent isolation, so the community could easily visit the sick. They used hydrotherapy with central flowing fountains to soothe patients. They employed sound and musical therapy with specific calming tones. They integrated color therapy through gorgeous, purposeful architecture. And they prescribed customized diets. Contrast this beautifully advanced holistic care with today's fragmented, stark, beep-filled, white-walled hospitals. It's night and day. I absolutely love this little historical detail. Patients in these Mirkistans were not discharged until they were healthy enough to eat an entire roasted chicken. It's a lighthearted historical fact, sure, but it perfectly illustrates just how deeply early Muslims cared about complete physical and mental recovery. They weren't rushing you out the door. They made absolutely sure you were truly nourished and restored before you went home. Which brings us to our final section, reclaiming prophetic wellness, building the modern Maristan. So how do we bring this back? It starts right here in our communities today. There is a massive modern campaign currently underway with the goal of training 500 imams and community leaders in suicide postvention and prevention. They are merging cutting-edge scientific evidence directly with Islamic ethics to save lives. Because think about it. When someone is in crisis, they often go to their imam first. Equipping these leaders with actual clinical tools is quite literally a lifesaver. So bridging the gap is absolutely crucial here. Step 1, we must understand mental health scientifically, recognize the biology and the trauma for what they are. Step 2, train community and religious leaders so they're equipped to handle crises and actively remove stigma. And step 3, cultivate access to culturally aligned therapists. We have to ensure people can get professional help from experts who actually understand their spiritual and cultural background. I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful quote from Dr. Rania Awad. Our lands and bodies are no longer colonized, but our minds still are. She really challenges us to recognize that by turning exclusively to Western models and feeling inferior, we are completely ignoring the rich, holistic foundation established by early Muslim pioneers. We have to decolonize our approach to mental health and reclaim our own brilliant legacy. And that brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Will you continue to let stigma colonize your mind, or will you reclaim the holistic healing heritage of your past? It is time to abandon the harmful myths, embrace seeking help as a profound act of faith. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this analysis has equipped you with the knowledge to look at mental health in a totally new, historically empowered light. Keep learning, keep seeking healing, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to really unpack this profound, silent, and just deeply consequential social crisis. We're talking about the heavy stigma surrounding mental health within the Muslim community.
Right, such an important topic.
It really is. And we're pulling from an incredible stack of research today, mostly focusing on the groundbreaking work of Dr. Rania Awad. She's a clinical professor and psychiatrist at Stanford.
Yeah, her work is amazing.
And what we're going to explore is how she's taking modern clinical therapy and actively integrating it with ancient Islamic heritage to, completely change the conversation around mental well-being.
It's a critical mission, honestly, because for a very long time there's been this artificial wall built between modern psychiatry and traditional faith.
Right.
And Dr. Awad's research at Stanford, specifically her work in Islamic psychology, it's tearing that wall down. She's basically proving that looking forward clinically actually requires us to look backward historically.
Which is fascinating. But before we get into the historical genius of all that, or, the clinical data, I want to take a second to speak directly to you, the listener.
Yeah, please do.
If you're tuning in and you have ever felt isolated, or if you've been overwhelmed and then felt judged by your own family or your community for struggling mentally, please know that this deep dive is a safe space for you.
Absolutely.
We're going to explore how getting clinical help isn't a departure from your faith. It's actually a deeply rooted part of it.
That's the perfect place to start, because the barrier to that healing is the core issue Dr. Awad really highlights in her work.
The stigma.
Exactly. It's this heartbreaking reality that mental suffering is frequently and very dangerously dismissed simply as a lack of faith or, a lack of iman. It's framed as this sort of spiritual failure.
Right. There's this pervasive narrative you hear, like a true believer doesn't get depressed. It treats depression as if it's some kind of spiritual scorecard. Like, if you're sad, you must not be praying enough.
Which is just completely divorced from medical reality. I mean, mental illness is multifactorial. It involves biology, the environment, genetics, trauma.
Right. It's not just a mindset.
No, not at all. And Dr. Awad uses postpartum depression to illustrate just how disconnected the stigma is from actual science.
I'm so glad she focuses on that, because the biology of postpartum depression is, well, it's undeniable.
Exactly. I mean, we are talking about a condition that affects roughly 1 in 5 women.
Wow. 1 in 5.
Yeah, it's incredibly common. When a woman gives birth, she experiences this massive, immediate crash in hormones, like estrogen and progesterone just plummet.
While also dealing with severe sleep deprivation.
Right, and the physical trauma of recovery. It's a profound biological event that physically alters brain chemistry. But when a mother begins to experience the clinical symptoms of postpartum depression, the weeping, the profound emptiness, severe anxiety, she's often met with this incredibly unfair shaming.
People tell her she should just be happy she has a baby.
Exactly. Families will tell her to just be grateful for the healthy baby, or that she needs to strengthen her connection to God to feel better.
Which, the logic there is completely broken. I mean, imagine someone falls and shatters their leg in 3 places, or, they get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Right.
Nobody looks at a diabetic whose pancreas has stopped producing insulin and says, you know what? Put down the insulin syringe. You just need to pray harder. That would be medical negligence.
It would be universally condemned. Nobody would accept that.
So why do we treat the brain as if it's some mystical entity just floating outside of the physical body? The brain is a biological organ. It runs on neurotransmitters, chemicals, electrical signals, just like the pancreas runs on insulin. If the chemistry is off, the organ struggles.
And when you ignore that biological reality, you don't just delay healing, you actually actively inflict a secondary trauma.
How so?
Well, when physiological suffering is reduced to a spiritual failing, it breeds severe isolation. The person suffering begins to internalize all that stigma.
Oh, I see.
They start thinking, not only is my brain chemistry making me feel awful, but the fact that I feel awful means God is abandoning me, or I'm a fundamentally bad person.
So you're just trapped in this echo chamber of shame.
Precisely. And from a psychological standpoint, shame is one of the most isolating emotions a human being can experience. It causes people to withdraw entirely.
Right.
They stop seeking community support, they hide their symptoms, and they certainly don't go looking for a therapist. And this isolation isn't just emotional pain, it's becoming a measurable crisis of survival.
And the data on this survival crisis is, it's staggering. Dr. Awad's research really gets into the systemic stressors that are creating a perfect storm for the community right now. And we need to look at those numbers.
The numbers are incredibly sobering. Dr. Awad's lab objectively tracked data regarding specific systemic stressors. For example, looking back around 2017, there were intense fears surrounding the travel bans and the implementation of public charge policies in the United States.
And just to establish the baseline here for you listening, we're looking strictly at the documented public health impact of these policies. The public charge rule basically created this massive wave of fear that if an immigrant or asylum seeker accessed public resources, which includes public mental health services, they could be denied a green card or even deported.
That is the exact mechanism of the crisis.
Yeah.
You have people who have survived immense trauma in their home countries. They endure the trauma of displacement, and they finally arrive seeking asylum.
Yeah.
But because of this policy fear, they become absolutely terrified to access the very clinics designed to treat their PTSD or depression.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. Dr. Awad tracked a highly tragic series of suicides among these specific populations during this time. They felt completely trapped. They couldn't go to the public clinics out of fear of deportation, and they couldn't go to their own community because of the stigma that their trauma was just a weakness of faith.
They were just squeezed from both sides. Nowhere was safe.
Yes. And it manifests in a much wider systemic emergency. Dr. Awad actually co-authored a study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the findings were startling.
What did they find?
They revealed that suicide attempts among Muslims are double, or sometimes even more, compared to other faith groups and non-faith groups.
Double. Wait, that is an astronomical difference. What is the clinical mechanism driving that specific disparity?
Well, in suicidology, there's a well-established framework for why people attempt to take their own lives. It's heavily driven by two overlapping psychological states,
Okay.
a thwarted sense of belonging and a perceived burdensomeness.
Meaning you feel like you don't belong anywhere,
Hmm.
and you believe your existence is actively, like, dragging down the people you love.
Correct. Now, apply that to the community we're discussing. You have intense external pressures, right? Systemic Islamophobia, political rhetoric, discrimination. That fundamentally thwarts a person's sense of belonging in broader society.
Right, they feel rejected by the outside world.
Exactly. Then they turn inward to their family or their mosque for comfort. But the internal community stigma tells them their depression makes them a bad believer.
Wow.
That reinforces the perceived burdensomeness. So when both your belonging is thwarted and you feel like a spiritual burden, the human mind really struggles to find a reason to endure the pain.
I hear that, and the compounding effect of systemic trauma makes complete sense. But I'm thinking about a listener who might be, say, a third-generation citizen. Someone who's highly educated, upper middle class, completely insulated from immigration fears or public charge policies.
Right?
Are they immune to this crisis? Because, I mean, we see mental health struggles everywhere right now.
That's a vital distinction. And no, they're absolutely not immune. The trauma isn't just political. It's fundamentally tied to modern life.
Yeah.
Dr. Awad points out that the hyper-capitalist culture we live in, this constant chase for worldly success, which is often referred to as the dunya, and the impossible shifting standards of social media, they completely throw our baseline out of balance.
We're just completely overstimulated and, underconnected.
Yes. The human brain was not designed to constantly compare its own behind-the-scenes reality with the highly curated highlight reels of 8 billion other people.
It's exhausting.
It creates chronic dopamine burnout and chronic inadequacy. This modern friction affects young men and young women regardless of their socioeconomic status or citizenship. Any lifestyle that strays so far from our fundamental biological and social needs is going to cause fractures in mental health.
But this is where Dr. Awad's research offers this incredible, paradigm shift. Because to survive this very modern, hyper-connected crisis, the solution isn't some brand new, secular Silicon Valley wellness hack.
No, it's not.
The community actually needs to look backward. They need to reclaim a completely forgotten legacy.
It's a remarkable pivot in the conversation because integrating clinical therapy and faith isn't a modern compromise. It's not watering down religion to fit into the 21st century. Clinical care is the original Islamic standard.
Let's dig into the concept of asbab, because I think that's central to this.
Absolutely. Asbab essentially translates to taking the means or taking action.
Okay.
It's the theological principle that you must actively do the work in the physical world. There's a very famous hadith, a documented saying of the Prophet Muhammad that illustrates this beautifully.
What happens in it?
Well, a Bedouin approaches the Prophet and asks a question that carries the exact same stigma we see today. He essentially asks, if I am sick, should I seek treatment or do I just rely on God?
Wow, it's the exact same just pray more debate happening centuries ago.
And the Prophet's response is definitive. He says, seek out treatments, O servants of Allah. He explicitly explains that God does not send an illness without also sending its cure.
That's really powerful.
The profound takeaway here is that seeking out medical treatment, which definitely includes psychological treatment and medication, is not a lack of trust in the divine. It's an active fulfillment of it. You are commanded to seek the cure.
It perfectly mirrors the famous concept of tying your camel. You know the story. The one where a man leaves his camel untied, saying he trusts God to keep it from wandering off.
Yes.
And the prophet tells him, tie your camel first and then put your trust in God. It's about personal responsibility meeting faith.
Yeah.
So going to a therapist, unpacking your trauma, taking an SSRI to balance your serotonin, that is literally tying your mental health camel.
That analogy holds up perfectly under clinical scrutiny. And you see this incredibly high emotional intelligence modeled throughout the prophetic tradition. One of the most powerful examples Dr. Awad highlights is the prophet's own grief over the death of his infant son, Ibrahim.
This detail, it really shifted my perspective. Because in so many ancient traditions, prophets or leaders are depicted as these stoic, unfeeling statues who are just above human suffering.
Yeah, especially in tribal societies of that era. Showing deep emotional vulnerability, particularly for a male leader, was often viewed as a weakness. But when his infant son passes away, the Prophet Muhammad openly weeps. His companions are actually surprised by it, and he tells them, "The eyes shed tears and the heart feels sorrow."
He literally validates the biology of grief.
He completely normalizes it. He doesn't repress the emotion. By stating that the eyes shed tears and the heart feels sorrow, he establishes a permanent precedent. Emotional pain, sadness, and weeping do not contradict your faith. They confirm your humanity.
That is so profound.
It is. Repressing grief doesn't make you a better believer. It just leads to compounded psychological trauma down the line.
And what absolutely blows my mind is how the early Muslim scholars took these teachings and basically laid the foundations for modern clinical psychology. Centuries before Freud or Jung were even born. We have to bring up the 9th century polymath, Abu Zaid al-Balkhi.
Oh, al-Balkhi is a revelation for anyone studying the history of psychology. Standard textbooks almost always start with European thinkers in the 19th and 20th century.
Right, usually it's all Europe.
But in the 9th century, al-Balkhi was writing comprehensive texts on the human psyche. Dr. Awad did a remarkable cross-analysis. She compared Balkhi's 9th century descriptions of obsessions and phobias directly with the modern DSM.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is essentially the modern psychiatric Bible.
Exactly. And what do you think the comparison showed?
I mean, I'm guessing it was pretty close.
The diagnostic criteria matched almost perfectly. Balkhi wasn't just observing strange behavior. He was actively diagnosing what we now recognize as obsessive-compulsive disorder and severe anxiety.
In the 800s, that is wild.
But even more impressive than the diagnosis was his treatment plan. Over a millennium ago, Balkhi was prescribing a rudimentary form of exposure therapy.
Wait, how does a 9th century scholar even facilitate exposure therapy? What was the mechanism?
Well, Balkhi understood a fundamental truth about neural pathways long before we had MRI machines. He understood that avoiding a fear only strengthens the mind's fear response.
Right.
So instead of telling patients to just, pray their phobias away, he instructed them to gradually, systematically face the source of their anxiety while practicing cognitive reframing.
So he taught them to change how they thought about the trigger while they were exposed to it.
Yes, that is cognitive behavioral therapy.
That is CBT, over 1,000 years ago.
Exactly. He advocated for a sophisticated three-pronged approach. He used medical interventions of the time to balance the physical body, cognitive talk therapy to rewire the thought patterns, and spiritual support to maintain hope.
That's incredibly holistic.
He actually differentiated between depression caused by biological factors, which he called depression of the body, and depression caused by environmental grief.
It is just a stunning level of nuance. But, this intellectual framework wasn't just trapped in academic scrolls. The early Muslim societies took this philosophy and physically built it into the architecture of their cities. Which brings us to the Meristan model.
Yes, the bimeristans, or meristans. They are one of the most beautiful chapters in medical history. These were the world's first true psychiatric wards.
Though we need to completely erase the modern sort of Dickensian image of a cold, sterile asylum.
Oh, absolutely. Because usually when we think of historical asylums, we picture people banished to the outskirts of town, hidden away in shame.
Right, locked in a dark room.
That was the norm in many other parts of the world. But the Meristans in cities like Damascus and Cairo were the exact opposite. They were deliberately built right in the vibrant centers of the cities.
Why put a psychiatric ward in the middle of a bustling city center?
Because in Islam, visiting the sick is a communal, spiritual obligation.
Oh, I see.
By placing the Meristan at the city gates or the central square, the architects ensured that the community could easily and frequently visit the patients. It structurally integrated the mentally ill into the daily fabric of society.
So it was a physical manifestation of destigmatization. You couldn't ignore them, and you weren't supposed to.
Precisely. The architecture literally forced the community to confront and care for its most vulnerable minds. And the treatments inside these Maristans, I mean, it sounds less like a hospital and more like a holistic retreat.
Yeah, tell us about the fountains.
They were pioneers of sensory therapy. The courtyards featured specialized water fountains, but they weren't just decorative. The fountains were actually patented to produce specific acoustic frequencies.
Heating.
No. The physicians recognized that the rhythmic, continuous sound of falling water naturally calmed the human nervous system. It acts on the vagus nerve to reduce a racing heart rate.
They were utilizing acoustic engineering to treat anxiety.
Yes. They also utilized color therapy, surrounding patients with specific hues known to soothe and stimulate the mind.
Incredible.
They used aromatherapy. They even prescribed sound therapy by having musicians come into the wards. The musicians were instructed to play specific, uplifting musical scales for patients suffering from depression and slower, calming tones for those with severe anxiety.
It's just comprehensive care. And I have to mention the dietary rule, because it perfectly captures their understanding of the mind-body connection. There was a specific metric for when a patient was finally allowed to go home.
Oh, the famous benchmark for discharge. Yes,
Yeah.
a patient was not officially released from the Maristan until they were physically well enough to sit down and eat an entire whole roasted chicken.
Which, I mean, it sounds humorous today, but the medical logic is flawless.
It is brilliant. They understood that severe depression or mania inevitably leads to physical malnutrition. You cannot have a healthy mind inside a starving, depleted body.
Right.
The gut-brain axis, which we talk about constantly in modern wellness, was intuitively understood. The whole chicken rule ensured the patient had regained their appetite, their physical stamina, and their digestive health before facing the world again.
Okay, this history is just breathtaking. The empathy and the science are incredible. But I want to ground this in the present moment. If you're a listener hearing this right now, and you feel completely alienated from your local mosque because of past judgment, maybe an imam previously told you your clinical depression was a sin. How does knowing about a 9th century Maristan practically change your reality today? Are we seeing this historical empathy translate into actual shifts on the ground?
That is the most important question we can ask. Because historical trivia doesn't stop a panic attack.
Exactly.
The first step is validating that listener's pain. If you were shamed by a religious leader, that trauma is real and the leader was wrong, institutional change is painfully slow.
Yeah, it really is.
But what Dr. Awad is doing is moving this from history books into modern practice. She founded a nonprofit called Maristan, specifically designed to bridge this exact gap.
So they are actively reviving the model.
They are. One of their most impactful initiatives is called the 500 Imams campaign.
What does it entail?
They are actively bringing in religious leaders, so imams, youth directors, Sunday school teachers, and putting them through rigorous evidence-based training in mental health, first aid, and suicide response.
Because realistically, an imam is acting as a frontline healthcare worker, whether they want to or not.
Statistically, that is exactly what happens. When a family is in crisis or a teenager is experiencing severe psychological distress, they often go to the religious leader long before they ever look up a psychiatrist.
Right.
And traditionally, those leaders were never trained for that. They didn't know how to handle complex trauma, so they defaulted to spiritual advice, which unintentionally caused shame. By training them, the Maristan Project ensures that when someone comes to the mosque in crisis, the imam can recognize the clinical signs.
It totally changes the entry point.
Yeah.
Instead of hitting a wall of judgment, the imam can say, your soul is safe here, but we also need to get your brain some medical help.
Precisely. The imam can provide the spiritual comfort while acting as a triage center, immediately connecting the individual to professional psychiatric care. They are tying the camel on a community-wide level.
That's amazing.
We're witnessing a generational shift where seeking therapy is finally being reclaimed, not as a Western intrusion, but as a deeply traditional Islamic practice.
Which really brings us to the core message for you, the listener, today. If you tuned in because you're exhausted from fighting your own mind while also fighting the judgment of your community, your mental health struggles are valid.
They really are.
They are incredibly real, they're biological, they're environmental, and they're complex. Seeking out professional therapy, going to a clinic, or taking medication to balance the chemistry in your brain is not a failure of your faith. It's deeply and historically supported by the very traditions your community honors.
Taking care of your mind is a fulfillment of the life you were given. You belong to a millennium-old tradition that actively commands you to seek out the cure. You do not have to suffer in silence, and you never have to choose between your faith and your mental well-being.
Centuries ago, the architects of the past built the world's very first psychiatric wards in the vibrant beating centers of their cities. They surrounded those struggling with the healing acoustics of water, tailored nutrition, and music. They refused to hide the vulnerable away.
Yeah.
If the brightest minds of the past believed that mental health deserved to be the very heart of the community, what does it say about us if we allow anyone to suffer in the shadows today?